Hey, everybody, and welcome into our Junior Summit webinar. We're really excited to have you here. By way of introduction, my name's Jim Wismer. I'm the director here at IV Experience. We're a comprehensive college prep company. For those of you who don't know us, we offer services in college counseling, essay and application coaching, SAT, ACT, AP, and other standardized test preparation, and academic tutoring. We started as a small company in the Philadelphia area, but we've since worked with students in more than 40 states and 20 different countries, helping them be accepted to more than 500 different universities. As our director, my job is to oversee all of our tutoring directly, work with our families on their standardized testing plans, and speak with many of our new families about whatever they're interested in here. I'm joined by Alyssa Coltrain. Alyssa is our director of college admissions. Alyssa, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. As Jim mentioned, I am the Director of College Admissions for Ivy Experience. And essentially what that means is I leave all of the math to Jim, but I help students from starting as early as eighth grade all the way through the college process, including talking about all of the factors that we're going to discuss here today through essays and applications until we send them off to their dream school after graduation.
Excellent. We're also joined by Kevin Trudel, one of our senior college admissions specialists. Kevin, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Kevin. I work in the same team as Alyssa. I'm a former admissions counselor, having worked at UC Berkeley and Grinnell College. I work with students here at Ivy Experience in a multitude of college counseling capacities, and I'm excited to present this information to you guys today.
Awesome. Now, a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. For our YouTube audience, please like, subscribe, and share our content around. We do these to dispel myths and misconceptions in the college admissions space, and your help in spreading our reach is invaluable. Uh, for our live attendees, please use the Q&A feature located at the bottom of the Zoom screen to ask questions throughout the presentation. We'll stick around to answer all of your questions at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into our content for today. So we always like to start our big picture webinars by talking about what factors are actually in a student's control in college admissions. All kinds of factors go into whether a college admits a particular student, things like demographic information and what other students at your high school are doing, your parents' education level, etc. All these things are going to factor in some way or another. But when it comes to students' ability to invest their time and energy into improving their outcomes in this process, there are really five things, sort of a sixth, that are in a student's control. And that's how we structure a lot of the advice that we give to families. And that's how we'll be structuring our presentation tonight. So those are grades and the rigor of your coursework, standardized test scores, letters of recommendation from teachers, extracurricular activities, and then the written components of the applications. We include the college list here. It doesn't really help you get accepted to a specific college, but of course, putting time and energy into your college list is going to ideally lead to better outcomes for you in the long run. So these are the things that students should really be focused on. And we're going to talk about, okay, it's January of junior year. What can we be doing here? I'll kick us off by talking about what is traditionally the most important factor in all of this, which are, the one factor of grades and academic rigor. So grades and rigor historically have been the most important factor in admissions. I call grades a necessary but insufficient condition for selective college admissions. And what that means is that you must have excellent grades, but at the same time, excellent grades don't sort of tell the story themselves. One thing to keep in mind as a junior is that junior year is the last full year of high school grades that an admissions officer will see on your transcript. And therefore, we consider it the most important year of high school for that reason. There's a very simple reason that the junior year grades are the most important. It's just because junior year U is much more similar to college freshman U than, ninth or 10th grade U was. Teenagers are growing and maturing and changing all the time, as we all are, but teenagers at a faster rate than us. So it's good to, just keep that in mind that this grade is going to be super significant. Now, one thing to keep in mind when we talk about grades is grade inflation. And if you've been to one of our other presentations, I bring this image up quite a lot, but essentially it shows that the percentage of freshmen at four-year universities in the United States who had at least an A minus average went from 21.8% in 1966 to now 84% of the college going population had at least an A minus average in high school. To put that in terms of admissions data, what I'm showing here is the common data set for the University of Pittsburgh's main Pittsburgh campus. And we can see here that according to the data, 61% of students had at least a 4.0 GPA, and that the average GPA of an enrolled student at the University of Pittsburgh was 4.08. So they use a weighted GPA system at the University of Pittsburgh. That's how you get over 4.0. This is standardized. So they're not, if your school has a 5.0 GPA scale, they're not using that. They're using a weighted 4.0 scale for this. But the important thing to keep in mind is just that, having those excellent grades is very, very important for this process. So the other thing that is very relevant at this time of year is course selection. And course selection, we have some general advice, but really it's going to be very specific to the student. I'll hand it off to Alyssa to talk about this.
So one of the ways that families can, in some ways, combat grade inflation and help to distinguish students is, of course, not just getting A's in classes, but choosing the courses that you, of course, are hopefully getting A's in thoughtfully. This is the rigor component of grades and rigor, not just the grade that you receive in the class, but the difficulty of the class that a student chooses to take. And we are in, especially for our families on the East Coast, this our full course selection mode for senior year. We're having lots of conversations with the juniors already working with us about this. And in many ways, the trick is to challenge yourself, but set yourself up for success. We have families ask us all the time, is it better to get the B in the AP class or the A in the on-level or the honors class? And some of that is about a holistic evaluation of how can you lodge the best grades that you possibly can while still challenging yourself. And that may be not taking every single course at the highest level, but picking and choosing thoughtfully so that you are able to do your best work and still stretch yourself. That being said, for students who are truly aiming for the most prestigious and selective universities, it is important to take the most challenging courses available as well as, do well in those classes. That being said, we also know that sometimes the best laid plans go awry. If you have stepped into a course that turns out to be too challenging, it is important to consider your mental health, not just your academic prospects. College is 4 years, your mental health is the rest of your life. Be honest about when it's time to work with a tutor, to speak to a teacher, to consider dropping from the class, because if you need to drop early, it's earlier on, it's possible to drop from a course without having it show up on your transcript.
Now,
So go ahead.
what does that mean that students should do now? For many of our students, we're in midterms time, so it's going to sound a little crazy when I tell you to start thinking about final exams and AP exams, but actually, midterm time or finals time if you're on a semester system, uh, it is the right time to be thinking about final exams, and that's because it's going to show you how well you've been learning the material from the first half of the year. This preparation for midterms is a good kind of template for what it'll look like to prepare for final exams. And if you don't have midterms, you should be thinking ahead to finals anyway. Essentially, how well you're doing in the course now is sort of going to tell you how much time do I need to invest specifically to study for this cumulative exam at the end of the year. One thing to note, as we'll be talking about on a future slide, is that AP exams are now more impactful in admissions than they were in the past. This would especially, excuse me, especially be true for a student who might be applying without an SAT or ACT score. So that's something to keep in mind. We really recommend when it comes to, preparing for these to study in small amounts over time rather than trying to cram everything at the end of the year. When you're struggling in a course, there are a couple different steps that you can take. So I'd recommend, first of all, reaching out to your teachers for assistance. Many teachers make themselves available, before school or during lunch, after school, during free periods. And that could be a great way to get a little help and also potentially factor into your letters of recommendation, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And you should also consider forming a study group. I was the kind of student in school. I started tutoring for money in eighth grade, so I was always helping my friends with their schoolwork. And so studying with friends was the way that I was able to study myself. It was my favorite way to study, was helping someone else learn the material. So if you're the friend who's struggling and you need to ask a friend who's doing well in the class for help, don't think of it as an imposition. It's really a great way for that friend to study as well. So, in a way, you can really be helping yourself by helping them. If you find that these other kinds of interventions are not getting the job done, that's when I would recommend thinking about tutoring. Working with a tutor can help you not just with the material at hand, but also big picture to learn how to study more effectively and form good habits around your schoolwork that are going to serve you for the rest of high school and even beyond into college. When we tutor for school subjects, we are also taking test taking strategies into account. This isn't just for AP tutoring when there's that AP exam at the end. We want to know how your teacher is grading you and use that to make sure that you're preparing for your tests in the class in the most effective way. When we are tutoring for APs, we're going to kind of figure out what balance of form and content makes the most sense for the given student. So when I say form and content, I mean form as in test taking strategies and content as in the actual underlying content of the course. To do really well on any kind of test, you really need to master both the form and the content of the test. And so we help students figure out, well, how much help do you need with each and focus in that way. Either way, if you know that end of year exams are going to be a struggle, I would recommend starting tutoring in those subjects sooner rather than later, because the better underlying understanding you're building as you go, the less of a daunting task it's going to be to get ready for those year-end exams. With that, I'll pass it off for letters of recommendation.
Right. So, hey, why are these letters of recommendation important? Right. The short answer is because they can reveal things about you as a student that aren't present in other parts of your application, right? There's going to be quantitative factors like your GPA and how you do in certain classes in your rigor that speak to certain qualifications you have as a student, but other skills, sometimes we might label them as soft skills, like, hey, how engaged are you intellectually, right? How do you communicate with others? Do you help, forward a classroom dynamic? Those are sorts of things that you can only get from something like a recommendation letter. So it's an opportunity to kind of reveal parts of you. It's an opportunity to make a positive impression on an admissions office. And it's an opportunity to also show, growth over time, right? Because, hey, maybe you have a teacher who can speak to like how you grew in a subject area. So it's a great way to qualitatively get some third-party insights from other educators, right, in the admissions process. Now, looking forward a little bit, right, who should you ask to be your recommender? So the first thing is, there isn't necessarily a universal answer. You should first check the requirements of the schools you're applying to, and not just the universities themselves, but think about the programs you're applying to, right? Because that could impact what is required in the admissions process. An example is at MIT, probably unsurprising to some of you on here, one of your recommenders must be from math and science, and one must be from a humanities, social science, or language teacher, right? Certain specialized programs like the SMD or Duquesne's health science applicants, you have to have only one letter. And basically, depending on the program and the university, the requirements will change. Now, once you've identified what's required, right, you should really focus in on core subject teachers, right? Ideally junior year, because at that point, you've probably taken a more difficult class, a class that's more reflective of what you'll experience in college. And start with your core subjects areas, because those are, to be fair, what speak most directly to skills that apply in college. Now, with that said, there are certain exceptions, right? Because here's the thing, right? You need to pick someone who will have good things to say about you, right? Don't just pick a junior year core subject teacher just because they fit those criteria. if you didn't do well in their class, if they don't have positive things to say about you, if you just kind of showed up, took a few tests and got an A, they don't have a lot to write in that letter. So you need to think about who has positive things to say about you. You may also want to think about who can really speak to who you are as a person, right? Maybe they have insight into your fields of interest, into ways you've overcome things, persevered through things in your personal life, et cetera. So it doesn't have to just be junior year core, but like that's a good starting point. Now, with that said, I mean, there are sort of other people who can, non-traditional recommenders, who can sort of speak to positive aspects of your life. I think Jim, like I love talking to Jim about this because he has some great anecdotes here. So Jim, I do want to throw to you, and you want to give him your story.
Sure. So generally speaking, when you're given the option to have an other recommender, an additional recommender beyond the kind of minimum that they ask for, this typically doesn't make sense unless they can add something truly unique to your application. I had that situation in high school. So my main extracurricular activity all through high school was track and field. The only problem was I was a late developer physically, and I was just bad at it for 3 years. Now I became the captain of the team and the second leading scorer on the team in the spring of my senior year. Spring of senior year doesn't get on your college applications because they're all due in the winter of senior year. So, what that meant was that I had this kind of gaping hole in my extracurricular activities where it was just, JV, JV, JV. And I was doing, three sport athlete track and field for 3 years and nothing really to show for it tangibly. The thing is, I was actually in a leadership position on the team. Before there were so many lawsuits, our coach actually allowed me to supervise the weight room at the tender age of 16. That's not something that you'll find that happens anymore for a variety of reasons. But the point is, I was trusted by the coaches with things like that. I was running the fully automatic timing systems at our meet. I was in charge of, the crew that put the hurdles on the track and removed them. And so I was given all these extra responsibilities because the coach could rely on me. And my head track and field coach throughout high school was actually also my ninth grade social studies teacher. So he could speak to who I was as a student, but also had seen this side of me that was reliable and trustworthy and responsible that he could speak to show people like, hey, even though this kid is not physically going to be varsity over these 3 years, he's putting in the effort, he's putting in the time, and it's paying off in other ways. That's a situation where it can make sense to have an optional third recommender, but it's not going to make sense for the majority of students.
But that's exactly right. And sort of using Jim's story as an example, right? Try to think of people who have seen those kind of other skills or other parts of you that we spoke about in this part of the presentation. So, that could be a coach like Jim's example. That could be maybe somebody because you maybe work a job outside campus or you volunteer a lot at a certain organization. So try to think about people who can speak to sort of those qualitative academic or personal soft skills, who has a lot of positive things to say about you. Now, with that in mind, now that you kind of have a sense of who you should ask, next question is, when should you ask, right? So we typically recommend that you ask, these junior year core teachers, if that's who if that's who you can get, right, before the end of your junior year. There's a few reasons for this, right? Teachers get inundated with these requests, right? Think about your entire class, right? And, those core subject teachers, there's only a handful of them. And if everybody's asking them, they have a lot to do. So first off, right, you can actually confirm that you're getting something from them, right? You can also ask at a time when they're not busy, right? If you're asking someone from a recommendation letter a couple weeks before it's due and they're already writing dozens of these, right, they may not have the bandwidth to do it, even if they have great things to say about you, even if they'd be a fantastic recommender, right? So that's just the high level start there, right? Now, with that said, even if you get their, you ask them, you get affirmation, they're going to write that recommendation letter for you, right? Once you've kind of moved into senior year, you're working on your applications, don't forget to follow up with that recommender, right? Because, hey, teachers, counselors, we're all human too, right? So you need to make sure you follow up with them, remind them of deadlines, right? When things need to get done, because maybe you're applying early somewhere, right? Don't forget, you can offer to provide them additional information with your teachers or your counselors. A brag sheet where you kind of like list your accomplishments and your interests can be a good resource. obviously this person should have context for you and context of who you were in their classroom and your academic soft skills, but maybe they don't know that like on top of doing the stuff you were in class, you were working two jobs and you were really hustling out there and doing other cool things, right? So offer to provide that to them because it may be helpful. So don't forget to follow, right? It's the short thing here. Once you've gotten that confirmation in your junior year, make sure to follow. Okay, now moving on from recommendation letters to another thing that is a big part of the application process, standardized testing. So I think, during COVID, we had a period of time where folks were moving away from it. I think a lot of families were thinking, okay, test optional, this is not a big deal. And I think this leads to a fundamental question. What is the point of standardized testing, right? So it's one of those things that ultimately colleges, when you're sitting in an admissions office, you want to sort of predict a few things when you're making that decision on whether you accept a student, right? You want to be able to predict like, hey, is this person going to be a successful student on campus? Maybe they're looking at their, thinking about, hey, when they come in freshman year, are they going to get good grades? Are they going to graduate in 4 years, right? Are they going to stick around and be here, right, and make it through all right? Other things that we're thinking about in the admissions office is we're thinking about like, hey, the local context here. So we will receive a profile from your school, about your grades and stuff like that. But having a sense of like the average ACT or SAT in your school district, in your school, will provide context of like, hey, are you just a normal student or have you really accomplished something meaningful? So standardized testing is another way to kind of differentiate yourself in that local context. Something you may have seen on university websites is we engage in holistic review oftentimes. Many institutions do that. And so having another data point is useful there. And the other thing is as well is that it's a way to kind of provide additional validation for like, hey, is this person really qualified? Are they going to succeed on my campus, right? So with that in mind, let's think about when these standardized tests are used and when they are required, right? And like how they're used and why they're used.
So when we talk about third-party validation of standardized test scores, I want to return us to our grade inflation data from before, because when everyone has an A, no one does, right? Because an A doesn't show you an exceptional level of work anymore. It shows you the grade that 84% of students get. And when we actually track trends in standardized test scores over a similar time period, standardized test scores have trended downwards in recent years. So this is important to note because in the world of standardized testing, these tests are standardized. The average ACT score is what I use as a data point here. ACT, the scores have been steady for a long time. They hadn't changed the test for decades until this past fall. That's why I use it as a point of comparison over this same time period. The SAT redesigned their test multiple times. When it comes to ACT scores, we can see that for decades, it didn't really vary from, between roughly 20 and 21. And then in more recent years, and especially coming out of the pandemic, those scores started to decline. And that's while, by the way, more students than ever are getting straight A's. In 2024, that came down a little bit because we no longer had a year of COVID grades in the data from that kind of second half of 2020 or of the 19 to 20 school year, when grades were kind of frozen. Now we're seeing a changing tide when it comes to test optional schools. So pretty much everyone went test optional during COVID. I gave a massive webinar on, well, I shouldn't say massive, but a webinar that focused completely on test optional just a couple weeks ago. So I'm not going to bore you with too many details when it comes to test optional policies, but I do want to hit on some of the highlights for those of you who weren't there. These are just some quotes from university admissions officers and higher ups about test scores. But test optional, it's important to remember, is a spectrum. And I like to think of there being really 6 different test optional policies out there. Of these 6 different test optional policies, what I have here is essentially how many schools in the US News and World Report top 100 rankings fall into each of these categories. When I say US News and World Report rankings, we don't use them because they're good. We use them because they're convenient. So this is not an endorsement of those rankings. It's just something that everyone knows and we can reference. So of the top 100 schools, according to U.S. News and World Report, this is how many schools fall into each of these buckets. Now, why is this important? Well, because four of these policies are what are known as test optional. When you hear that a school is test optional, it could be any of these four things. And these are based on roughly the number of students who actually submit test scores at each of these schools, is how the data is segmented in this list. I point this out because it's not always totally clear kind of what test optional means. So we have schools that are test optional that are admitting over 70% with test scores. Of the examples here from the test optional era, Penn and the University of Texas actually went back to requiring scores. Duke is the only one that's still test optional, and they're actually on my short list of schools that may be going back very soon. That's just a prediction of mine, by the way. That's not insider information. And then you also have schools that admit fewer than 30% of their students with test scores. And so test optional is kind of not created equal everywhere. I think it's important to remember why schools are test optional. They're essentially test optional because it benefits them. Test optional policies allow students more flexibility in admitting the students they want to admit. So many colleges have, well, all colleges have what we call institutional priorities. And just as a kind of back of the napkin definition of institutional priorities, it would be students that the college wants to admit, and they know that they want to admit these categories of students for reasons other than just that they're great applicants in other ways. So examples might include the quarterback of the football team, a French horn player for the orchestra. Could also include, first generation students. They want students from all 50 states to be able to say that they have students from all 50 states. So you'll see many different ways that colleges exercise institutional priorities.
Sorry,
There's, oh, go ahead.
sorry for interrupting, but I just wanted to give folks here that this is a very real thing, right? So when I was working in admissions at Grinnell College, I won't go into specific numbers because, hey, like, respect the institutional privacy there, but every year we were looking to admit a certain percentage of students from Iowa. That was an important institutional priority. We are proud of our heritage as an institution in the Midwest, right? And I understand that there may be more competitive school districts in Chicago, in New York, in LA, but we need to have that representation. That was an institutional priority.
Right. And you'll see that very commonly with state schools. So if anyone has relatives in Michigan, it's a whole lot easier for them to be admitted to the University of Michigan than out of staters. Out of state, Michigan might as well be an Ivy. In state, it's a state school. So the U.S. News and World Report ranking algorithm was another reason colleges went and stayed test optional. Two of the factors that are used to rank schools there are average test scores. And of course, when you make them optional, the bad scores go away. And then also one of the factors of the ranking is the acceptance rate of a school, which is to say the number of students admitted divided by the number of students who applied. How do you get that number smaller? Little math lesson, you increase the denominator. So the more students who apply, colleges are still only going to admit the number of students that they can actually serve. And so more applications sends that acceptance rate down, and colleges benefit from that. So the bottom line of test optional policies is, oh, sorry, one other thing before we get there, is that there are often ifs, ands, and buts of test optional policies. So, for example, homeschooled students are very rarely able to apply without test scores. That makes sense because if you can see what happened with school teachers' grades over that period, imagine what happened to mom's grades over the same period. And then certain programs or majors at test optional universities might not be test optional. We worked with a student one fall who was applying to Elon Nursing. And if she hadn't gone to Elon and taken a tour and happened to hear someone say that the nursing program wasn't test optional, she would not have had a test score to apply with. And then she had to spend the fall of senior year cramming for her standardized test. Some schools will let you be test optional, but not if your GPA is below a certain threshold. And then colleges do sometimes, or at least we have examples of colleges applying imputed scores to students, which is to say using, some kind of algorithm based on the other factors in the student application to guess at what that score would be based on their grades and other information on their application. Cornell was the big one that was found out about. but you can imagine it's happening elsewhere as well. So the bottom line of the test optional movement is that a strong score is still an admissions asset. Even when scores are optional, it doesn't mean they're using them. Rather, it doesn't mean that they're de-emphasizing scores. It just means you have the option to apply without them. When you apply with it, it can still help you in all the ways it always has. The more selective a school is, the more important having a score becomes. Two reasons for this. One, the most selective schools in the country are more likely to require test scores. The whole Ivy League, except for Columbia, requires test scores. A lot of other highly selective schools like Georgetown, MIT, Stanford, Caltech. And so you give yourself a better chance even at the test optional highly selective schools. And that's important because they're so competitive. At the same time, you're more likely to need it there. Having a strong score is going to expand your options both for college choice and merit scholarships, meaning when we talk about being able to choose where you apply, being the chooser rather than the choosee, you're going to have more options with a strong test score. And then this last point is important as well, which is if the amount of work it would take for you to earn that test score is just unrealistic, that it would take away from your ability to invest in your extracurricular activities, do as well as possible in your coursework and all of that, there are still plenty of test optional options available to you. So, with all that said, let's talk about your options for standardized testing. There are two main options, the SAT and the ACT. So, the SAT is a four-section test. You have two reading and writing sections and two math sections. You get a score in reading and writing out of 800 and a score in math out of 800. Relative to the ACT, the biggest challenges on the SAT are going to be the limited annotation tools. You take the test in a digital interface. There are some annotation tools that are quite useful, but it's not the same free form you can write anywhere on the paper that you get with the ACT, where when they give you a geometry diagram, you can just draw on their diagram instead of having to draw a whole new one from scratch, for example. Um, the verbal questions on the SAT tend to be more challenging. The level of diction in the passages is higher. The vocabulary is more challenging. The complexity of the sentence structure. And also, the SAT is adaptive, and this can sometimes provide a slight challenge to students. When I say it's adaptive, everyone starts in the same level, module one, and your performance in that module one dictates whether you're fed into an easier or a harder module two. So, that easier or harder module two is going to dictate where you can score overall. There is overlap in where you could score from the harder module two and the easier module two, which is why we have it kind of represented as a spectrum here. There is no like hard cutoff necessarily, but if you want to score your very best, you want to be testing into that harder module two. The adaptive nature of the test makes it so that the timing of the two modules can be quite different. In other words, even though you get the same number of questions and minutes in both modules, if the second one is much harder than the first, then it's harder to finish on time. So that adaptive nature of the test can sometimes throw a curveball to students. The ACT, on the other hand, the composite score or overall score of the ACT is made up of three sections: an English section, a math section, and a reading section. So, one of the big differences off the bat is that the ACT is two-thirds verbal. Often, students whose math scores lag behind are going to end up scoring better overall on the ACT. The ACT has an optional science section. I recommend most students take that unless for some reason it's a significant challenge for you. It's optional most places. Georgetown requires it, Boston University, and Pomona. Boston University and Pomona are actually both test optional schools, but if you submit the ACT, it must include the science section. The ACT has an optional writing section that no one should take. Don't sign up for it. Colleges don't want it. It's a waste of your time. The biggest challenges on the ACT relative to the SAT are timing. You just have more questions in fewer minutes per question on the ACT overall than on the SAT. The ACT's math content is broader. So the SAT's math content stays in a narrower range of topics, but the problem solving and logical reasoning of the problems is a bigger challenge. The ACT hits you with a broader array of topics in the math section. One important thing on the ACT is that you should take it on paper. And what I mean by that is that you can take the ACT on paper or a computer when you sign up for the test. You should take it on paper for two reasons. One is it's more available on paper. More test centers offer the paper ACT than the computer-based ACT. And two is students tend to go slower on the digital version of the ACT. So this is because the ACT is a paper test that they just put up on a screen. It's not really designed to be a digital test. So certain things like the fact that the passages are long and you have to scroll up and down a lot actually end up costing students measurable amounts of time. And students will tend to have more issues with the time limit on the computer than on the paper version of the test. Um, so with all that said, like how do we determine which one of these two tests to take? The best thing to do is to try both. So we're going to send out as a recap to this webinar, both an SAT and an ACT practice test, and your student can either do both, or if they already have an official score or a PSAT score from one, then they can just try the other. We're happy to grade and compare that for free for anybody and evaluate the results and give our recommendation. If one of those two scores ends up being much stronger than another, then it's obvious which one you should take. You just take the head start and you run with it. And if the scores are similar, then we end up taking a more nuanced approach. Last thing I want to say about standardized testing is AP scores are emerging as a more significant factor in admissions. And this is important because, as Kevin said, standardized testing partly it gives us third-party validation of grades, and AP scores are a great way to do that. AP scores are even more important for students who are not submitting an SAT or ACT score because that then it might be your only third-party validation of your grades using a standardized test. I have here a quote from John Ladding, Emory's Dean of Admissions, that they just don't trust GPA like they used to. And this is in the context of him saying they're relying on AP scores more in admissions than they ever have before. When I started doing this 10 years ago, AP scores were a very minor factor, and they've only increased in importance over time. So, how can we help? I mentioned diagnostic testing, so we will share that with all of our attendees here. You can also book a free planning call with me anytime if you're even considering working with us on tutoring. If you're already working with us on tutoring, I'm always just an email away to set up one of these calls if you want to kind of talk about your student's plan and make any adjustments. We meet students where they are. So when we do test prep, it's all one-on-one with targeted sessions, practice that the student completes every week that dictates what we focus on in that week's session, and parents receive updates after every session. So if you're interested in learning more, Alyssa's going to post in the chat the link to book a 15-minute call with me, and I'd be happy to speak with any of you. With that said, let's move to greener pastures with extracurricular activities.
Yes. And that link, I believe, is the most recent post in the chat. So please feel free to reach out to Jim with any questions. So we're now moving on to extracurricular activities. Up to this point, with the brief segue into letters of recommendation, since we were talking about course selection, we've been talking about the quantitative factors in your application. You have an A or a B or a C in the class. You have a 1310, a 1560 on your SAT. These are statistical quantitative components, which are in many ways the most important factors in the college application process until they aren't. As students begin to apply to more and more competitive schools, they are then competing with students who have similar grades, similar rigor, similar standardized testing scores, and then the qualitative factors, letters of recommendation that Kevin already walked us through, extracurricular activities, and then later on we'll talk about essays and applications become increasingly important to distinguish one student from another where they may look very similar on paper. So extracurricular activities, you have the opportunity to list up to 10 of these on the common application. And this is what colleges look at to see who you are going to be on their campus outside of the classroom. What kind of, club member are you going to be? How are you going to contribute to their campus community? What are the hobbies you have, the things that you enjoy, the passions you have that might that you would bring to and to help enrich their campus. And that can be a range of different opportunities. There is no set checklist on what a college is looking for. You don't need to have a job, a club, a volunteering position, a summer internship. You can pursue athletic or creative talents, intellectual pursuits. This could be social justice or civic engagement. There are a lot of options here, but ultimately, the goal is authenticity. Admissions officers are looking to get to know students as they are and imagine who they're going to be on their campus. So it may be that pursuing the thing that you are most interested in might lead to a candidate that is pointy, where a lot of their extracurriculars lead towards one thing. The baseball student who volunteers teaching baseball to, underserved students, who also does a home run derby that helps raise money for the Red Cross, that runs a blog critiquing, Major League Baseball scandals. There are a lot of different ways to engage with even just one thing that catches a student's interest, because one of the most important parts is privileging that depth over breadth. So that leads us to, all right, how can students engage? And especially for juniors, this is the moment to build on things that you're already doing. Instead of joining 3 new clubs, consider applying to a leadership position in a club that you are already in, but also think about non-school sponsored activities. Um, 30 seconds ago, I riffed off baseball, and I think one of those things probably would have been a school-sponsored activity where you can, sure, be part of a team, but what else can you do? If you are fascinated by biology, join the local riverkeeper organization. Get one of those iPhone microscopes and take pictures of the neat little organisms that you find growing in local streams in your area. In some ways, it becomes more difficult to be authentic because finding opportunities, developing them yourself, taking initiative can be more difficult than simply signing up for another club. But it is so much more worthwhile. It gives you a chance to pursue the things that you are deeply in love with, as opposed to just adding things to a resume. I think, especially for juniors, there's this tendency to go, well, what can we add now? We know we're coming up on admissions. The 2 best things to do in this moment are you still have this upcoming summer. It's a great opportunity to add an internship, a passion project, a part-time job. Feel free to reach out to Kevin and myself. We love talking about extracurriculars. This is a great moment to add something where it's clear that it isn't just adding something for college. But the other component there is if you are looking to add something new, a part-time job is a great thing to add right now because, in a sense, there is a legal labor law reason why a student could not have had a job in freshman or sophomore year, in that state law in most cases prohibits children from working before they turn 16. So it is a great way to add something else and go, well, there's a reason why we didn't start doing this until 16, and it has nothing to do with college admissions. All right. And I'm going to hand it over to Kevin to talk us through one of our other sort of factors.
Yeah, so I mean, so far, right? Like some of the things we've talked about, there's a certain degree built in, right? Like your grades freshman year, sophomore year, if you're before that point, this is the junior year summit. That's kind of baked into the equation, right? If you've been sitting at home playing video games, freshman and sophomore year, we do encourage you to do something, talk to us. We can provide you some ideas, but that's baked in, right? One of the great ways you can, in the short term, kind of create outcomes in this process is in you being smart about building your college list. Now, there are thousands of colleges out there. Okay, you have a lot of options, right? I understand that, we think about the Ivy Leagues, but there's a lot of others. We have a lot of other institutions out there that are great. And with that said, right, you're only going to have the time ultimately, and technically the logistical space in the common application to apply to a certain number of schools. So you're going to have to make some limitations to your list at some point, and it is okay for those limits to be superficial, right? With a couple of exceptions, most universities are going to have the thing you're going to want to study, right? If you're interested in biology, political science, basic forms of engineering, it's in most institutions. So it's okay for you to think about like, hey, I would feel isolated in rural Maine, or hey, uh, I want to be in a place with a great sense of community, right? Where I'm not just one of a million. So it's okay to think about other factors, because remember, college is not just a place you're getting a degree. It's going to be your home for 4 years, So it's okay to think about your social, emotional, financial fit, and to have other considerations beyond just a major or the dreaded US News rankings that Jim referred to before. Now, as you're beginning to think of more sort of the categories of things, right? One way that we often categorize schools in making this list is in reach schools, target schools, and likely schools. Okay, and so you can categorize them that way, basically based on what are potential chances of getting in. So reach schools are the most challenging schools for everyone to be admitted to. To be fair, depending on your profile, right, it may be hard for you, maybe not hard for your neighbor down the street, but essentially it's a school that is difficult to get into based on your profile. Now, typically schools with under an admissions rate of 25% are a reach school, and they're a reach school for almost everybody, because there's so many applicants who apply to those schools, right? Now, target schools, right, that middle sort of group, will vary from student to student, right? So it kind of depends on what your profile is, because, ultimately there is a difference between having an SAT score of 1150 and 1550 at the end of the day, right? So these are schools you should really think about, sort of might be a good fit for your profile. Schools with admissions rates of above 25% can be seen as targets depending on your profile. Now, likely schools, you may have also heard them referred to as safety schools, are schools with higher admissions rates. If you want a general rule, think of admissions rates above 75%, and typically those schools are often characterized as likely or safety schools. Those are schools where you are more likely to be admitted based on overall selectivity, or based on your profile being very strong for that institution, right? So that's a kind of a basic way we often categorize schools. Now, with that said, if you've categorized schools on the list, how many of each category should you be applying to, right? What you'll see on the internet, what you may hear from your school counselor, from a teacher, is it's often important to have a balanced list. The way that is often characterized is, as you can see here, 3 reaches, 3 targets, 3 likelies, with a 9 total, right? Sometimes you may see 3 or 4, 3 to 5, 3. Let's use that as an example, right? So while that is an approach, we don't always subscribe to it. There are other approaches you can take as well, regardless of what approach you take, right? The number of schools ultimately on your list, what you should definitely do is have at least 2 to 3 likely schools there. 2 to 3 schools that are likelies or safeties that you would be legitimately happy to get an acceptance from. Not that you're just putting on your list to make mom and dad happy or your school counselor happy, but after taking a look at the school, feeling out the fit, the academics and all that, you'd be legitimately happy to attend, right? Now, as far as reaches, right, you can apply to as many of those as you'd like. You can cast a wide net, but just keep in mind, if you're going to apply to a lot of reach schools, you're going to hear no a lot, just because those schools are ultimately hard to get into. And even if you're a great student, a qualified student, there's a lot of great applicants to those schools. So if you're going to do that, just keep that in mind. The other thing to keep in mind as you're applying to these schools as well is you have a limited amount of time at the end of the day, right? So think about the work required to apply to those schools, not just the number. Just because you can apply to a lot of schools, you may not actually have the time to do so in a way that's judicious, in a way that you can put your best foot forward. So with that said, how can you identify for yourself what's a reach school, what's a target school, or what's a likely or safety school? If your school has a service like Naviance or Score, where that, and just for the parents at home who may not be familiar with that, that's typically handled by the school. It allows you to kind of see how many applicants from your high school apply to different universities, who got in, maybe there's some of their quantitative factors, right? You can use that as a starting point. You can also use a resource called the Common Data Set. It is the data that each university sends to the government every year, so it's very reliable. You can Google it, whatever university common data set, and typically find it that way. The other thing is, as you're categorizing schools into reach, target, and likely, you need to be honest with yourself. You're not doing yourself any favors by being overly optimistic, right? If you've taken the SAT and you're sitting there with that 1100 score, don't just assume I'm going to have a 1500. I'm going to approach my list accordingly, right? Okay. Now that we have sort of a grasp of how you can categorize schools, how many schools should be in your list, what can you do now with your school list, right? You can explore college campuses. You can go on tours both in person and virtually. You can talk to friends, upperclassmen, family, other people who you know have attended the university or are affiliated with the university. I would also suggest having conversations at home about what a dream college experience looks like. Now, what do I mean by that dream college experience, right? So it is academically, what was it going to be like? Socially, what is it going to be like? What is ultimately going to make you as a student happy, both at the institution and as a graduate from that institution? Try imagining and identifying schools that fit that criteria, right? So, because that can help inform what the rest of your list should look like. Ultimately, you have to have the difficult conversations now versus later. So what do I mean by difficult conversations, right? If there are constraints, right? So if there are financial constraints on where you can attend school, if there are constraints on where a student or a family is comfortable with a student attending university, right? So finances and geography we have on the slide, right? Then you need to have those difficult conversations now, because it's going to be heartbreaking for a student to find out as they've gotten a decision back that they can't attend a certain school because of a certain constraint. So you want to have these difficult conversations now so you can set parameters for schools that are options and schools that aren't realistic for your family's needs. Okay. Now, we broke down schools into categories of likely, target, and reach. Taking a look a little further, how can I be sure something is a likely school? What does having 2 of these and 3 insurance schools look like? So what you can do once you have the data that you need, whether you got that through Naviance, the common data set, the examples we gave, what you want to look at are GPA, class rank, and test scores, and where do you fall as far as comparing yourselves to the students who got in. If you're in the 75th percentile of accepted students in those quantitative factors, that's a good indicator that this is a likely school for you. You want to have at least 2 to 3 of these likely or safety schools. They are a good fallback. Beyond being a good fallback option and a safety and an insurance plan, they're also a great option because you can oftentimes get merit scholarships to these institutions, and they can provide a great sort of counterbalance to a target or a reach. And so I think Alyssa, who I've talked to has a great story about this.
Yes. So, as I see some families that I've worked with in the audience, for those of you who might know me, I grew up in the Philadelphia suburbs, where the sort of likely schools du jour were Pitt and Penn State, these massive public schools. I still remember to this day sitting in an 11th grade math class when the Penn State rep showed up to my school and watching every single junior leave the class to go see the rep except for me. And I sat there and looked at the math teacher who went, I bet you have a book in your backpack, don't you? And I sat there and read for 45 minutes. But choosing your likely schools that fit you is hugely important because I was a very nerdy, introverted kid who would have drowned at Penn State. It would have made no sense for that to be my likely school. So my family and I were thoughtful about looking at the smaller liberal arts colleges, smaller class size, more nurturing environment, a high level of academic rigor, so that at the end of that process, out of all of the schools that I was accepted to, I actually did end up attending one of my likely schools. Firstly, because they were as thoughtfully chosen as the rest of my list. It was a small private liberal arts college, but also because since it was one of those likely schools, I was a very attractive candidate to them, and they were able to, despite being a private school, offer enough merit money that I ended up going to my alma mater for essentially the same price as in-state tuition at one of those big public flagship schools. So this really isn't a chunk of the school list to sleep on. Having your worst option be a really great option. Make sure that everyone sleeps better at night.
Absolutely. And so here what I love about Alyssa's experience there, right, is ultimately reflects a fundamental value we have in building the school is that you should be just as excited to have attended to get into a likely school as you are a target or a reach, and that there's a lot of great options out there. We work with a lot of students and in college counseling, and one of the ways that we support students in college counseling meetings is in helping them identify these schools that would be a great fit for them. Now, with that said, another component of the application that you have a lot of control over is your college essays. And let me sort of hand things off to Alyssa so she can tell you a little more about this.
Yes, this is part of the presentation where I tell you we have clearly saved the best and most fun factor until the end, but I may be a little bit biased or partisan in that front. Another major part of the college application, of course, is going to be the college essay, that 650 word Common App essay that almost every student writes, plus some supplemental essays. We'll talk more about the what of it in a little bit later, but right now I want to talk about when. And that is in many ways right now. Not necessarily because you may start writing your essay anytime soon, but now is a great time to reach out to us about this, to start thinking about essays and brainstorming, even if you don't choose to work with us, because what starting early allows you to do is to think deeply and thoughtfully about what you want to reveal to yourself, about yourself to an admissions officer, to brainstorm and leave it to marinate, and then come back with a fresh set of eyes and think through what you might want to do. And to find a balance between getting these applications done and having, living a life that is rich and fulfilling and occasionally full of AP biology tests that you really need to spend that weekend studying for. So starting early gives you the grace and the bandwidth to do a really fantastic job on this while still giving yourself time to breathe. You're going to want to take full advantage of the summer after junior year. For those students who are taking AP exams, it's a great time to really jump in and start writing, that essay that you've already brainstormed with us beforehand. After your AP exams, when the pressure from school comes off, so that you can maximize your time throughout the summer with the goal of getting the vast majority, if not all of this essay and application work done before senior year begins. Now, junior year can be really tough. That being said, senior year can also be very academically rigorous. The first half of senior year grades often go to colleges, regular decision, any deferred early action decisions. So leaving yourself time to focus on schoolwork and not be frantically finishing your essays Halloween night. No one wants that. We don't want that for you. You don't want that for you. Get this done early so you have time to do well in your classes and enjoy being a senior. Do not sleep on this. So, in many ways, beyond extracurriculars, the college essay is going to be the thing that is the most distinguishing factor when it comes to college admissions. They distinguish you from any other applicants when all other factors are equal. This is the one chance that a student has to share who they are, how they see the world, and what matters to them in their own voice. And this is the moment where an admissions officer can start to root for a student. We've had handwritten notes that our students have shared with us where admissions officers have gone, hey, this essay really spoke to me. The picture we have here is a note that a student received from Rice University where they are heading, and they specifically sent a note with calling out the theme of his essay. These are things that turn admissions officers, application readers into cheerleaders because it allows them to truly see a student for who they are and who they're going to be on their campus. So this is an incredibly crucial part of the process. So, as I mentioned before, there is firstly the college essay. When you hear, seniors, parents, teachers talk about the college essay, this is going to be the personal statement or the Common App essay. This is the longest essay. It tends to be about 650 words. And this is the essay that's going to go to almost every school that a student applies to. We're also going to briefly, and we'll talk more about these as well. You're going to see some other supplemental or school-specific essays where a student is going to write for a specific prompt for a specific school. That might be why this school, why this major, about your activities or community or an element of your lived experience. I'll let Kevin talk a little bit more about those later on. But for all of these, the most important part is going to be brainstorming, deciding what to write about, what stories to tell, the angle to approach. It is when we work with students, so much of the work happens before the very first word goes down on the very first page, before the very first draft. And it begins by casting a broad net. Students collaborate with parents and putting everything down. What do we need to know about you? What is your favorite color? What is the silly nickname that your uncle has for you? What is the funny story that happened 2 summers ago at the petting zoo? Put down everything because great personal statements can come from almost anywhere as long as it is true to who the student is and who they're going to be on campus. And the trick with that is to focus on story and experience. You might be, a practical person. You can write that down, or you can tell me about that part of your backpack where you have 17 different pencils and 3 different types of granola bars, including the specific one that you buy for your friend who has celiacs, and batteries for a calculator and spare erasers. And then I really believe that you are that practical, reliable person. And from those experiences, from those concrete details, we begin to generate a sense of why these things are important to you. And you can go to 2 different places for these ideas. The first is, of course, your resume. Activities, though remember, they'll show up elsewhere on your Common App. Service, jobs, leadership, but often the best essays are going to come from what we call the eulogy topics. Not in a morbid way necessarily, but if you are speaking of someone who has passed, or if you're giving a toast to someone at a dinner party, it's not likely that you're going to stand up, and go, here's to Mark and his A in AP English. You're going to tell a story, talk about a quirk or a hobby and an experience. And that is something that won't show up anywhere else on the application. So it's a really great place to incorporate into the personal statement and let the student speak to the admissions officer in their own voice. That being said, the personal statement isn't the only essay. We have a handful of specific supplement types that different schools may ask students to write. And Kevin, I'm going to let you walk people through those.
Right. So those supplemental essays are essays that go to a specific university. It's beyond what's required in the Common Application. Sometimes just to apply into certain universities, typically the Ivy League as an example, you have to do these supplemental essays. Sometimes a university that typically may not have supplementals, if you apply into a specialized program, like an honors program, you have these supplemental essays. Now, there are some fundamental types. And I want to be clear, the reason I'm giving this for the conversation is, having worked in an admissions office, when we ask something specifically of an applicant, we are asking it for a reason, right? We've gotten all the stuff from the Common App. We have that material. If we're asking for additional stuff, we want it for a reason. So one of these supplement types, one of these essay types, is the Why College essay, right? We've given you a couple of examples in this slide to point to the fact that this Why College type can come in some different shapes and sizes. They can come as short as 100 or 150 words, like that Wake Forest essay. They can be really long, like 500 or 650 words, like the Wisconsin-Madison essay. But ultimately, they're asking, why do you want to attend college here, right? Share what has made you interested in our institution. And a couple of things to keep in mind as you're doing this, right, is one, there's an easy test you can do to see if you've passed, right, is if you put the name of another institution in this essay that you wrote about Wake Forest or Wisconsin-Madison, it's not a great essay that speaks to why you want to attend that school, right? Another thing to keep in mind is why you distinctly want to go to that school. So if there's an experience that you had on campus, if one of your friends who's an upperclassman went there, if there's something distinct about your interaction with that school, those are exactly the type of details that can speak to why you specifically want to go there and make you stand out from the stack of applicants who are also writing to this same prompt. So those are the couple things to keep in mind for the Why College essay. Another supplement type is sort of why academic essays. And these can also come in some different shapes and forms. Some of them ask directly about a major that you're seeking to apply to. Another example will oftentimes speak to a specific college or school within a larger university. So we gave an example of Michigan here. Describe the unique qualities that attract you to the specific undergrad college or school to which you are applying to the University of Michigan. So that could be like a school, college of business, or engineering, or arts and sciences as examples, right? So as far as what to keep in mind here, first, it's okay if you don't have your entire life figured out. It's okay to indicate that you're undecided in this essay. But here's the thing, you should have some sort of intellectual interest. Ultimately, you're going to college for a reason, right? So try to think about things that you're interested in, maybe problems you want to solve when you graduate someday, or things you want to explore, classes that you have interest in. So just don't default to saying, I don't know what I want to study. I have no idea what I'd study here or what I'm interested in intellectually. Try to take the time to explore what you want to explore intellectually, and you'll find something to write about here. Another common supplemental essay type that you'll see as in your application process are what we call activity essays. And these are pretty straightforward. They oftentimes ask for a meaningful activity or an activity that you're proud of. The example that we've provided here, right, speaks to what is the most meaningful activity you engaged in. So the things to keep in mind for activity supplemental essays is that, first, be flexible. It doesn't have to be a traditional school activity. It doesn't have to be about your time in Red Cross Club or on the soccer team. Usually you have a lot of flexibility in what you describe as an activity. It could be something you did with your church, or as a volunteer somewhere. It could be something you did maybe with a group of people, sort of publishing a website or something like that. There's lots of options here. So don't limit yourself with this activity essay. Second thing is try to focus on personal contribution and stories, right? Using Jim as an example, there's a big difference between saying, hey, I was on the track team, we ran in meets, we worked out sometimes, and having that be the essay versus giving that full context of, hey, the coaches, I really worked at it, even though I wasn't the greatest runner when I started. I was kind of slow and I wasn't as physically developed. I really stuck with it. I really love running, and the guys I met in the team, and I set up X and Y. Those details, those personal contributions, turn something that might be something that an admissions officer just kind of skims over and doesn't think much about into something that stands out to them that they think about after the fact, right? You don't want this to be a resume entry, because ultimately your activities list speaks to some of your just general engagement with activities anyways. You don't need to repeat that again here. You want to get into those personal details. Another sort of common supplemental essay type is what we characterize as community essays. Now, I think you can kind of see in this example here from Cornell, they basically ask you to identify a community you belong to or a community that is meaningful to you. You can sort of share. The prompts will vary a little bit, but essentially you're going to be thinking about that community you belong to, how it shaped you, maybe how you shaped it, and maybe perhaps even, depending on what the prompt says, how it may shape your experience at a university. Like I was discussing with activities, first off, don't put yourself in a box. You have a lot of options. Community can mean a lot of things, right? Community engagement, yes, it includes your neighborhood, it includes stuff at your school, pep club, stuff like that. It includes volunteering, but it can also include a lot of other things. Maybe you're someone who loves dance, and it's something that you've done for years, and you're part of a community of performers or dancers. That counts, right? Maybe you've loved Korean dramas for as long as you can remember. You've written reviews on them. You started a fan club and the whole bit. You're a part of a community. All those things can count. So here's the thing, right? Once you've identified that community, like with some of these other essays, and I think you guys can sense a theme here, try to think about contributions, try to think about meaningful details and stories that can speak to how that community has influenced you, your place into it, and how it might influence you moving forward. So that's another common supplemental essay type. Now, a final one that we're going to speak to here is something that we characterize as the lived experience essays. Essentially, these come in multiple ways, shapes, and forms. Some of them will ask directly about your lived experience. Some of them may speak to an institutional priority of diversity and ask to your connection to it. We characterize all those things under this umbrella of lived experience essays. We provide an example here from Vanderbilt, where their model, they provide the motto, dare to grow, and they want you to think about a component of your identity, culture or background that's played a role in growth and how it contributes to the campus community, right? So anything that asks you to kind of reflect upon the place you've come from, who you are as a person, that can be a lived experience essay. Now, once again, right, it's okay to take a moment and reflect. I understand it can be difficult because you're not asked to do this type of writing often. Normally when you're writing for an AP class or something like that, it's, hey, we're trying to do X for a specific purpose. But it's okay to take some time and think about this. It's okay to ask people in your life, who have maybe shared these experiences with you, to reflect upon them. And so once you kind of begin to identify formative things in your life, you can kind of make the types of connections that might be meaningful in answering a specific prompt like this, or that speak to a wider, meaningful lived experience. As always, right? Details, stories, anecdotes are always positive things. Having those details can really make an essay pop. Now, we work with students in multiple ways on these essays. I will let Alyssa speak to that.
Yes. So when it comes to essays and applications, and honestly, the entire college counseling process, we work with students from the very beginning of this process all the way through the end. We work on unlimited meetings and drafts, but beyond simply being essay editors, we are project managers. We set deadlines, we follow up, we nag if we have to. We are mentors and support systems. We will get on calls and talk through deferrals and anxiety. We will disprove the myths that come up when students and families talk to fellow peers. We are cheerleaders, and we bring a level of expertise that helps make this process as as low stress as possible. I don't think any of us can process that there will never be any stress in this process, but we provide unlimited support, starting with brainstorming through outlining, drafting, reducing essays down to the word count, and college counseling and follow-up throughout. That being said, and this is something that students and parents, I encourage you to bear in mind, even if you work with us, you work with an English teacher, you do this entirely on your own. Students need to write their own essays. Admissions officers read thousands of these essays every single season. They know what a 16, 17-year-old, 18-year-old sounds like, and they are looking to get to know students. It can be really tempting, especially in, something that feels very important to go in and start embroidering. But admissions officers know when an English teacher, when a parent, when ChatGPT, God help us all, has gone in and started to rewrite and change a student's own authentic voice. A student's story and a student's voice is enough. That's something that we really believe. That's something that we work in our process to encourage and elevate and develop. So that is sort of the last thing I would have families take away from this conversation about essays is trust the student, trust their voice. Students, write your own essays.
Now, before we wrap things up and get into Q&A, I just want to take everyone through, since we had a whole lot of advice along the way here, kind of what your big picture takeaways should be for the rest of this school year. So, number one, as always, focus on getting great grades between now and the end of the year. Reach out for help if you need it through those various channels we discussed earlier. Request your recommendations from teachers before the end of this school year. You probably want to wait a little later in the year, but by the end of junior year, as we mentioned earlier, is the right time. Finish your SAT and ACT testing, or at least have your plan for finishing that in the fall ready to go. Deepen your extracurricular interests and solidify plans for the summer. And then contact us if you're interested in working with us on your college essays and applications. With that said, let's go ahead and jump into Q&A. So we had a couple roll in. We'll start with those, but please keep them coming if you have questions. Question one. If I'm going to apply to a music major, can I ask my music teacher to write my recommendation letter, even though the school says core teachers only? Kevin.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, first off, if you're applying to a conservatory, right, music specific programs, it's going to be a little bit unlikely that they're going to limit you that way, right? So, what I will say is what takes precedence is what is required. And the only reason I say that is that if a school is requiring something specific, if you haven't done it, you are at the risk of being just automatically rejected, right? Now, as I said before, it's probably not going to happen in your case if you're applying to these specialized programs, these specialized majors. So I wouldn't let that stress you out. And the nice thing is as well is that beyond the quote unquote required recommendations, schools will oftentimes give you the option to submit additional materials or have additional recommenders. So if that music teacher is someone who can speak a lot to your growth, who can speak a lot to kind of your ability to tackle a subject, right? In this case, music, then they may be a great recommender, and it's okay to have them, even if there is a requirement for a core teacher.
One other quick note there is that in a case where you think the policy is ambiguous, just reach out to the admissions office and ask, because that is an option.
Yeah, no, I will say, like, that is something that I tell students and families all the time. Feel comfortable doing it. It's part of our job. We don't dislike it. It's something that we do frequently. And to be fair, I think, it's it's part of the job description. So it's okay to ask your admissions counselor or to call an admissions office and say like, hey, I don't understand X. Can you please give me some clarification?
Next question. How helpful are highly selective but pay to play programs like Yale Global Scholars or Penn M&T Summer towards the college application? Alyssa?
I'm going to speak briefly about summer programs generally, and then I'm going to open it up to sort of more broadly things that students can do over the summer. So, summer programs can be great. Um, like the Yale Global Scholars Program, like Penn M&T. There are a lot of options. They're great in that they give students a really structured way to explore something, often an academic interest. It's an opportunity to live on a college campus. If applying to a summer program is something that you or your family are interested in, the two big things to keep in mind are firstly, for many of those programs, those application dates are coming up sooner rather than later. So it is a great moment to get any applications in. And also, the programs that are going to be looked at more highly are the ones where, yes, they may cost money, but the only barrier to entry isn't simply, you know, a parent cutting a check, where there is an application process where an essay or short answer needs to be submitted, where a teacher recommendation or a transcript needs to be submitted. Those tend to be looked at a little bit more favorably. That being said, summer programs are not the be all end all of what students can do over the summer. There is not a checklist. There are lots of ways that students can explore intellectual interests. And if you have a student who is engaged and has the initiative and diligence and, sort of self-discipline to keep yourself on track and pursue something independently, that can be equally as key in an application process, whether that's designing your own app for computer science students and putting it on GitHub, whether it's, game jams, whether that's for engineers buying a MakerBot 3D printer and teaching yourself through that self-paced curriculum they have and learning how to do computer assisted drafting. There are lots of options that students can pursue, and they aren't lesser than summer programs.
Awesome. Follow-up question about activities. Is doing research and having your paper published critical for highly selective colleges?
Um, I mean, we'll open this up to you two as well because I feel like I'm going to partially end up repeating myself a little bit here and going, research and publication can certainly be, an option that a student pursues, but it is not necessarily going to be the thing that a student should pursue in as an alternative to something else. It is an option. It is not the best option out there and available.
Yeah, I just want to add on a little bit here, right? So first off, in admissions offices, we understand that we are judging an applicant pool of teenagers, right? So it's one of those things that is not obviously like an impressive activity, whether it's this or anything else, is an impressive activity, regardless, right? I wouldn't necessarily say that you have to push for this as a make or break situation. I wouldn't necessarily say that if you're looking, for example, for summer options, that a pay for play to do something like this is like the best option. It can be a good option. It's not always the best option. So what I will, as a final note as well, right? For highly selective colleges, I would kind of default back to kind of some of the general advice we gave here, where like, think about, as long as you're demonstrating depth, as long as you're demonstrating depth and passion, it doesn't have to be in this form, right? So there's plenty of ways to show initiative in the STEM fields, and Alyssa gave some there are, for example, data competitions on Kaggle you can do. That's just something you can do in your own time, and you'll may even win some money on something like Kaggle, right? That show just as much passion as getting something published. I mean, the other thing is as well is that depending on the field you're in, generally, like it may not do anything for you. So it's one of those things that impressive activity is impressive activity, but you don't have to let this be the be all end all.
Right. So is doing research and having your paper published critical for highly selective colleges? The one word answer is no. And the last thing I'll add on that front is just that most of our students who are admitted to highly selective colleges, in fact, that might go as far as to say the vast majority of them have not published any kind of research. So it's definitely not a necessary criterion. All right. So next question. So what is the answer? Is it better to get a B in an AP while challenging yourself or an A in a course that is comfortable? Great question. We once posed this to an admissions officer at the University of Pennsylvania, and his answer was, well, you should take the AP class and get an A in it. And I'm kind of joking when I say that, but I will just say up front that if your goal is admission to some of the most selective schools in the country, the answer is get an A in the AP class, and there is not another answer than that.
I'm
However,
also, yeah,
go ahead.
I'm also going to jump in here because in some ways, that's not the right question because students take more than one course in a day, in a school year. The goal is always going to be to challenge yourself as much as possible while getting the highest grades possible. So if we're talking at that super highly selective level where we're going, we need all A's in everything. That might be if you're, a student like me, where math was a big problem, maybe that means you take honors calculus senior year and, AP Euro and AP French and AP English. Because if you take AP calculus, you will not only end up with a B in that class, but the weight of keeping up in that class will be such that it will affect everything else in your course load, where it will bring down the other courses, where it will affect your extracurriculars. So when you are choosing course selection, when you are choosing courses, the goal is to evaluate not just a single course, but to evaluate your entire course load and balance it in a way where you can get the highest grades possible while still challenging yourself. That being said, Jim, you are still correct, where if we're shooting as high as possible, yes, our ideal is all of the rigorous courses, all of the A's.
Yeah, last thing to say about that is just that you don't know when you sign up for a course that you're going to get a B or an A. So you can't really make the decision based on an answer to this question. Once you're in the course, you just do the very best you can to get the highest grade that you can, right? And when you're making the decision, it's more about the amount of time you're going to spend in that course, as Alyssa was saying. So I would encourage people not to really frame the question this way in the first place. But yeah, two answers, different sides of the same coin. Next question. Are schools looking to see if you've made an in-person visit to their school prior to applying? Kevin?
Yeah. So first off, before directly answering, I want to sort of categorize what this is, right? So when you're talking about in-person visits, attending a school's webinars, just stuff that shows interaction with the school, schools will sometimes call that demonstrated interest. And what that means is you've shown in multiple ways that you're interested in attending and that there may be a higher probability, if accepted, that you'll attend, right? The nice thing about demonstrated interest is you can kind of look up through the common data set, what schools count it and what schools don't. With that said, I got a couple notes on that. One is that it won't hurt you, right? Like if you go and visit Penn tomorrow, they're not going to look at that and be like, oh, this is a bad thing, right? But with that said, it may not do anything for you. So you have to see whether that school counts demonstrated interest, right? An example of a school that does would be like American University. So for those schools that do count demonstrated interest, going on an in-person visit, attending a webinar, opening up their emails if you sign up for their emails. Those are things that they will track. As a final note, something that we do work with students on, if you decide you want to work with us, right, one of the services we offer is called the College List Survey. In that, we'll make sort of a very comprehensive set of recommendations based on a large sort of survey that you'll fill out of schools. One of the things we'll let you know is, do those schools track demonstrated interest? So if you like that recommendation and you really want to put the best foot forward there, you can start taking those steps.
All right. Next question. Do you suggest a third recommendation letter from an activity outside of school? And I think the answer to this is simple. If it adds something unique and relevant to your application, then yes. And if it doesn't, then no. So it's not just the fact that it's outside of school, it's whether it adds something unique to your application or not. Two other recommendation questions. How important is the counselor letter, Kevin?
So it's one of those things, it is important. It's one of those things that it kind of frames kind of like how you are within the larger sort of local population at your school. I will say, don't freak out if you don't have the type of close relationship with your counselor that you do with maybe one of the teachers who's writing your recommendation letter. There's some things you can control in that respect. You can, and sometimes your school may have a policy asking for a brag sheet. You can kind of have a meeting with them if the time allows for it, to talk about kind of, hey, what your passions are moving forward. So it does count. It's not necessarily as important as some of these other high level factors as we've talked about, meaning your grades, your rigor, and also like test scores as well.
Great. And then can students see their recommendation letters? Kevin.
Yeah. So the interesting thing on that, like, the technical answer is you could, however, you shouldn't. So in the Common Application, there's this sort of federal education privacy law called FERPA, and you have the option to either maintain those rights and be able to see the letter, or to waive them, saying, I will not see that letter before, as it's sent in, before it's sent in, and all that, right? The reason you want to waive your FERPA rights, even though I know it might feel nerve-wracking, is because then we know we've gotten an honest assessment of who you are from that third party person who's your recommender. If you look at that recommendation letter beforehand, we don't know in the admissions office whether you asked 10 people and 8 of them had bad things to say about you, right? So while technically you can see that material, it's actually better for you in this process if you don't, and you're a bit strategic in choosing your recommenders.
All right, thank you. Alyssa, another activities question. Are activities like volunteering with local rescue squad or getting EMT certified attractive for college applications?
So I'm going to give sort of a broader answer. Part of this is, yes, it is certainly an activity that a student could pursue, could list on the Common App activities that, an admissions officer would read and understand the amount of diligence that requires, the amount of commitment that requires. That being said, much like doing research and getting your paper published, much like a summer program, these are things that students should pursue if they are genuinely interested in doing so. Now, there is no checklist of you must have done each of those things. For, a student who is interested in going into the medical field, for instance, pursuing EMT certification is a great way to show exploration of an interest they have, but also should be something that a student interested in medicine finds genuinely fulfilling when they are doing it. And in many ways, when it comes to extracurriculars, the trick, the strategy is to be authentic, to pursue for students to pursue what they want to do to the deepest and best of their abilities. And that will inherently result in a list of activities that is coherent, that is consistent, and that is revelatory of who the student is, who they're going to be on campus, and what they want to study.
Great. Next question. What does rigor look like on a transcript if your high school limits the number of APs students can take to 8 to protect students' mental health? A good question. This is information I would imagine would be part of your high school's school profile. The school profile travels with your transcript to a college. It contains information, as Kevin alluded to before, like your average SAT score at your high school. It also includes information on what APs are offered so that students aren't judged against a standard that they could not have, upheld at a certain school. So I would imagine a policy like this would be explained on a school profile, but you could reach out to your school counselor to ask about that. Next question. Why do most colleges ask for your intended major? Do majors affect your chance of acceptance? What is your advice if you're interested in a few majors?
Yeah, I'll jump in here to start. So there's a long and a short answer here. The short answer is this: there's not a universal thing you could say about this because different universities do have different policies. I and a few other people on the team called around the 50 schools that our Ivy experience students apply to most get the different policies of different schools on this front. Now, with that said, right, there are certain areas that are just a bit more competitive. Some university systems or universities will put it out there what the data looks like on that front. For example, the UCs just makes the data publicly available on if you apply to generally certain major areas, how competitive is it at the different UCs. So, I mean, you can from that data, you can kind of impute a little bit that like, hey, if I apply to a college of engineering or college of business, typically it's a little harder to get into. But that's not necessarily the case in all instances at all universities. Now, with that said, if you're interested in a few majors, it's okay to indicate those different areas of interest. I sort of had a brief conversation with the University of Wisconsin admissions officer last year that spoke to that. That it's like, hey, we understand certain majors at our university are competitive. Given that, it's not a bad idea if you have these different interests, indicate them because it says to us if you don't get into hyper competitive program, you're still happy to go here. So it's okay to indicate those interests, but unfortunately, there's not a universal answer here because different universities do have different policies on this front.
It is also totally okay to apply undecided if a student has, two or three things that they are deeply interested in. For those Y major essays, it just means the student treats it more like a Y intellectual interest essay and gives them the opportunity to speak to the multiple things that they are interested in, how they overlap, that they might not, with the goal of showing being undecided, not that you are uninterested, but that you are multi-interested, multi-decided, that, the offerings that a college has available are so exciting that, like a hungry person at a buffet, you can't decide what you want to put on your plate quite yet.
Awesome. Okay, final question. By the time I graduate, I will have been to 3 high schools. How would I go about getting letters of recommendation, and how would submitting transcripts work?
So that is something where it comes to transcripts, you are absolutely going to want to communicate with your school counselors. You will likely need transcripts from every single one of those institutions. So reaching out and starting this process now is going to be the most important part of this for you. It is going to be a lot of bureaucracy. You will also need to submit one of the optional sections in the Common App called the High School Transfer section, which gives you an opportunity to contextualize, why there was two different transfers over the course of the year. And as far as letters of recommendation go, I'd encourage you to use the phone number or the email address that is up on the screen. We can give some general advice here, but a lot of how you handle a letter of recommendations may relate to why transfers happened and where you were junior year and which high school you were at.
And we had one more question come in, which is, will it look unfavorably on a student if they choose to drop a sport or activity in senior year? which they've been involved in for their high school career to focus on academics. And I think the short answer is this is highly context dependent, and it would really depend on the student's situation. But Alyssa, would you like to chime in as well?
So, in some ways, yes, there's going to be a context component there. But to pose a couple of hypotheticals here, if dropping the extracurricular, the wow, words are hard. If dropping an extracurricular activity means that a student is able to, maintain a high GPA in this case, I might ultimately prefer to have a student, maintain a GPA rather than see it trend down. If focusing on academics means I just really worked hard junior year and I'd like to take senior year easy and I could keep my grades up and continue with this extracurricular, then maybe that's a different situation entirely. It's really going to be sort of context dependent there.
Awesome. Thanks everybody for the lively Q&A. That was definitely one of our more active. We appreciate all your questions. If you have questions that are more specific to your individual situation or asked one of those questions where we said it will be highly context dependent, feel free to reach out to us by email or phone. Info's on the screen. We really appreciate you giving us your time tonight and good luck with the rest of junior year. We hope you learned something and have a great night. Bye, everybody.